Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken and I am a senior editor with the Mises Institute, and with me as usual is Tho Bishop, my associate editor. And we're back to, we're going to do a thought experiment. We're going to go to an imaginary world where Donald Trump won the election of 2020. But we're going to look at political and policy reasons why, if you're in favor of freedom and human rights and not locking people in their homes and not forcing medication on people, and you're in favor of free markets and things like that, we actually dodged a bullet, I think, by Donald Trump losing the election in 2020. And Tho and I are going to talk about that a little bit. And so, Tho, I'm just going to go right into it. And we've got three reasons here, I think, why basically in the medium and long term, it's going to be a good thing that Trump lost in 2020. And I think one of the first reasons is just simply the realities of what's going on with the economy and inflation. We were already talking in late 2020, kind of expressing this idea that we're looking at where the economy's going, we're looking at what's likely with inflation, and we're starting to think maybe it's not the best that Trump wins and then be saddled with all of the blame for this economy that we end up with in 2022. So what do you think of that?
Absolutely. And what's also important is that this wasn't simply something that happened in 2020 itself with just COVID, that everything was going hunky-dory and then COVID happened. No, I mean, even going into the end of 2019, right, you had the repo crisis, which everyone's forgotten about now because there's been bigger stories since then. But there were issues, there were warning signs out there, not just with the American economy, but globally, that was red flags going off. You had financial issues going on with China right before the virus, which I think is interesting from a timing perspective of how that all played out. But if you have a crisis that falls under a Trump figure similar to what you had with Bush, regardless of all of the free market critiques of specific policies of that Republican administration, naturally, it's going to be blamed off of deregulation. That laissez-faire Trump administration, sort of those radical libertarians guiding Trump economic policy. That's what ran us off the ditch. And now you have to have Democrats come back in and clean up the situation like Obama did or FDR did, or, this entire legacy, right? And so just simply the fact that we're seeing inflation play out now under Biden has, I think, going to have massive political ramifications into what the solutions are. Again, there's I don't want to say that there's no blame that could go on from specific Biden policies this past year. I think there's been definitely changes on the margins in terms of energy policies that have roles here, not only in oil production, but also in subsidizing alternative energies that end up having things move around. But the biggest issues that have plagued this economy and will continue to plague the economy are not anything done legislatively or even by executive order the past 13 months or so that we are right now.
Yeah, I think always, unfortunately, for now, no matter how horrific his policies might be in terms of free markets, the Republican administration has this reputation as being the laissez-faire administration. So you got Richard Nixon, who was basically the opposite of a laissez-faire politician, right? He says we're all Keynesians now. He imposes price controls. He creates all sorts of new administrative bureaucratic agencies. He takes the U.S., he closes the gold window. All of these things that contributed to massive inflation and to huge problems in the economy. Boy, talk about logistical problems, right, that we have now. Just think about all of that stuff that occurred from price controls that the Nixon administration was dabbling in back then. And then even people who, thought they were free market or pretended to be free market, I don't know, however you want to describe them, they're years later still saying that Jimmy Carter was responsible for all of the bad stuff that occurred in in the 1970s. And so it works both ways, of course. Well, we can just assume that everything Richard Nixon did was free market. So the fact that there was high inflation in the 70s, that must have been all of Jimmy Carter's fault. And so it's just this proxy then where people don't actually bother to look at the actual policies. And that's the good point you make, right? Is that, yeah, there's stuff on the margins in terms of regulation and such that probably would have maybe made inflation, price inflation, a little less bad because production would have been able to keep up a little bit more with the demand. And so we wouldn't have seen as much explicit and clear price inflation in that case. And maybe there wouldn't have been as much fear of tax increases and so on. So those things, yeah, would have been marginal changes. But we're talking about much larger issues here, where clearly the Trump administration was into huge, massive deficit spending. But that was all part of a larger 10-year thing, 12-year, really, post-2009 economic, monetary, and fiscal policy situation that really fed into the inflation situation we're seeing now. And so certainly Trump, through many of his policies, both were anti-inflationary, but also pro-inflationary. But just by virtue of being a Republican, it's assumed that he was some sort of free market guy. So if you look out in the economy, years from now, you could totally see it, right? All these old NPR listening, white, gray-haired people, the sorts of people who still whine about Ronald Reagan like to this day. So you could see how in the year 2050, people still talking about, oh, man, if only Donald Trump had not been such a dyed-in-the-wool free market guy, then we wouldn't have had all those economic problems in 2022. And you could see how that narrative would even have some legs among a substantial part of the population. And so we don't have to deal with that now because Trump is gone.
And one of the interesting things is that there were Trump policies that were actually really, really good for, I think for the economy, right? I think the tax cut back then was actually was a lot better than I was expecting going into it. There was a lot of changes to the regulatory side of things, but as soon as you actually saw real economic growth, that's when Powell back in the day, he was trying to very slowly take the foot off the gas pedal and get us something resembling normalization of monetary policy, and that was shaking markets back the end of 2017, right? And so there was no stopping that side of it, and obviously COVID just ramped all this stuff up into crazy heights, even relative to the 08-09 days. The other side of it, though, is that if we're within this counterexample, like if there's one thing that we could have changed, more important than perhaps the Trump administration or the Trump election would have been those Georgia Senate seats or something like that, where you've had a more divided government. Right, that would have perhaps been a much better. That would have stopped some of the stuff that did get through. Right, you had the infrastructure bill that was loaded with all sorts of bad stuff within it. That was bipartisan, so that was okay. You had that early first run of COVID related spending, which was particularly troublesome with the way that it treated. One of the issues that we talked about prior to the election was this dynamic with dealing with the different levels of state debt. So like blue states were benefiting because red states were more conservative. And all of that sort of stuff was baked into this legislation that passed the Senate and then got Biden's signature. If we could have had a more divided government and kept the Senate, for all the issues there, again, Mitch McConnell is awful. All the just about every single Republican senator is awful. This is not an endorsement of the wisdom of Republican policies here. Simply, though, you would have had that greater faction, division there if you'd have had that Senate strongly red, or at least marginally red. But yeah, I don't think there is Trump wasn't going to have a magic wand that was going to stop these price increases that we've been plagued with, and I think. I think this inflationary moment, the impact that this is going to have on politics for the next 5 years, or along those lines, is going to be significant. And I'm glad that the free market party, if you will, quotes, is not the one overseeing that period.
Yeah, and we'll start to see some other issues too. Of course, inflation is just one aspect of the economy, right? You have when we delve a little bit deeper, we're looking at, are real wages keeping up? What's the cost of living? What's the inequality situation? All of those things, which certainly could not be blamed on an unhampered marketplace, but which, if Trump were president, there would be the situation where they'd be equating all of those problems with 8 years of Trump, and so that's just not going to be the situation now. So the second reason that it's a good thing Trump lost is the COVID situation. I think the narrative in America, because Americans, even with the internet, it was astounding at how many Americans were adopting a COVID narrative based just on what was going on in the United States. And so even though you had all of these European countries run by left-wing regimes or center-left types who had runaway COVID infection and deaths and so on, there was still this narrative that, well, we just wouldn't have any COVID problems at all in America if Trump wasn't president, because he magically would have been able to use some method to simply shut down the spreading of COVID. And so the campaign of 2020 then continued into this idea of, well, because Joe Biden's going to listen to the science, he's going to do whatever it takes to get rid of COVID, and he'll shut things down, or he'll make sure everybody gets vaccinated, and then COVID will just immediately disappear. But the reality, of course, is people are having to face the fact that Biden has no ability to change this, except at very small amounts, just like other regimes throughout most of the world, where the issues of the spread of the virus, as we've shown in recent articles at Mises.org, are largely dependent on factors far beyond just simply issuing a lockdown order and that sorts of things. Things that we were told if Trump did, COVID would magically disappear.
Right, and we've seen this play out with the various different measurements were worse in 2021 than they were in 2020, just from that performance side of things. Not that that's particularly surprising in a lot of ways, and one of the reasons though why the COVID dynamic here, for one, you did almost immediately have a backlash. The areas of the country that were the least, that were always the most COVID skeptic in terms of some of the government policies, tended to be red states. Once Trump was out of office, you now had governors being able to pivot to that standing up against the Biden administration sort of line, which I think helped there. And worth pointing out, while Trump, I don't think you can blame Trump necessarily for lockdowns in the U.S. per se, because that tended to be a state-by-state thing. There was effort, particularly early on, from the Trump administration. He was critical of Kemp in Georgia, who was the first state to open up things. He was big in what Florida did, because he saw the polling numbers and they were not going well. So there was pressure from the Trump administration during some of the earliest and worst parts of it. But the reason why the Biden administration that might have been even more prone to more and tried to do it, right? You had, if you didn't have the Supreme Court, for example, reject the COVID vaccine mandate from OSHA, that's something that would have been a massive expansion of government power. That, again, regardless of the partisan dance, right, would still have been very, very bad for a lot of people. And you still had a lot of people that lost their jobs because of COVID mandates. Out of, a lot of that was done by private companies that used the cover that the Biden administration gave for policies they supported anyway. But to a certain extent, the reasons why the COVID aspect is not as bad as it could have been has been the pushback from some of these institutions. And it's not necessarily that these institutions were fortified to make sure that they were protecting American liberty, right? It wasn't. That's not what was mobilizing, I think, the Supreme Court, as much as simply the difference in how these issues are being seen nationally by the time it actually came before the Supreme Court. So this is an issue that could have been much, much worse based on what the Biden administration wanted to do. Thankfully, though, the environment around it perhaps fueled a little bit by some of the increase in partisanship on this issue, created some safeguards that reined in what could have been a much worse situation there.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was actually surprised a little bit when some of the governors were willing to push back against the president, because you've seen it before, right? The president is the de facto leader of the party that he's from. This is just awarded to whoever wins the presidency. They get to be leader of the party, and then there's not much willingness from other people in the party to push against the president. And I think there was enough pressure at the state level that they weren't willing to go along with it. Many governors weren't, even though, as you say, the Trump administration was out there sending a whole lot of mixed messages. And there was no principled stand coming out of that administration, especially early on, against mandatory lockdowns and that sort of thing.
And to be fair, a mixed message is better than a cohesive message the wrong way, which is, kind of what you should expect in this sort of environment, right? That's what most of the world got. So I'll take a mixed messaging administration over a very dedicated New Zealand, but yeah, it was a bit of a mess.
Yes, true enough. They perhaps weakness and prevarication is preferable to just horribleness all in one direction. So yes, but nonetheless, I think the narrative had become weak enough by the time Biden came in that you were able to, and then that just added additional fuel to this drive to just combat the president thing.
Yeah, because think about this as the counterexample. If you were having the same issues like breakthrough cases, if the vaccines were failing under Trump's watch, think about how differently this whole thing would have been seen, and not in a way that would have been anti-vaccine, right? It would have been, okay, well, we've got to create some sort of new tools that are even crazier, right? I think if that would have been the pushback. Oh, there's something Trump's doing that is making these approaches not working as good as they could be. And so I think that as well, having the Biden administration, the administration of science, and that doesn't have any disconnect with Fauci and all this sort of stuff. The fact that you have this massive failing of the most aggressive procedures on that side of things is definitely has long-term benefits.
Yeah, that would have been very interesting to see in our alternative universe, where we saw those celebrities who were tweeting things about how I will never take this Trump vaccine. And then, of course, as soon as Biden becomes president, the exact same vaccine is now great. And so how would that have played out if Trump had won? Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, all of those things that now you can freely badmouth about just how wrong these pharmaceutical companies were, all of this stuff in the past about how, well, if you take the vaccine, you won't get COVID. And now you can pin all that on Biden because, well, it's his vaccine now, so he's got ownership of the whole thing. So I guess you could say it was sort of like the Iraq doctrine of you break it and you bought it. And so maybe now that Biden took charge of the whole COVID situation, well, it's deeply broken, but he bought it. It's his now. All those deaths that occurred on his watch now are thanks to Biden-esque COVID policies. This, of course, only sort of reflects reality in a very twisted way. But this is, of course, the simplified voter vision of things, right? Is that we can blame everything in this way on that guy. And that's just the reality of it in many cases. So that no matter what horrible things happening in the country, whether the president has anything to do with it, the president gets blamed in a lot of cases. So with so many things messed up, I'm glad that Biden is the one in the White House.
And as silly as this is, as much as this is a very shallow, superficial, partisan lens of things, I mean, this is what ends up guiding policy, right? I mean, backlash is real, not only in foreign policy, but in terms of legislative policy. And you would not have gotten the Dodd-Frank Act, for example, that whole thing would have been very, very different if it wasn't, used, if that didn't strengthen, if the prior crisis didn't strengthen the Democrats' hand with, you wouldn't have gotten Obamacare, right? You would not have had an Obamacare if you would have had a different partisan narrative on, the financial crisis prior to it, right? So these silly partisan narratives end up being incredibly influential on what does the actual laws of the land shaping the future. What causes all this sort of stuff.
Well, what's going to be the fruit of that narrative? That takes us to number 3. So this is number 3 reason why it's a good thing Trump lost, and that's because midterms are probably just going to be a bloodbath for the party in power this time around. It was pretty bad in 2018, but I'll be real interested to see what happens this time around, unless the Dems can spin some sort of amazing turn on a dime where Biden is no longer responsible for economic woes or for continued COVID problems and all of that sort of stuff. But as we know, the party who's in the White House tends to lose a substantial number of seats in most cases in Congress in those midterm elections. And the larger issue that you and I have often talked about, though, is state legislatures and how that often can be those are very important races, and also can be a product of the national narrative as well. So what do you expect to happen in November, and what's the medium and longer term fallout of that going to be?
Well, I think we're definitely setting up for a midterm that's going to look very similar, I think, to 2010. And the 2010 backlash to Obamacare, backlash to a lot of stuff that was going on. Which again, that period was so interesting because it was right after a massive change with the 2008 campaign. One of the big changes there was not only did you have you get John Boehner as Speaker of the House, you had the Tea Party wave, a bunch of new blood Republican legislatures within DC, and I think you're going to see that. I think again how much it really matters when you have someone like a Kevin McCarthy as a Republican leader. Interested to see if you have sort of a galvanizing, non-establishment Republican wing strengthened with all the new blood coming in. I have a feeling it's going to be less like the Tea Party than it was back then. So I think the Kevin McCarthys and some of that are going to be fine. I hope we'd like to be wrong, but that's my guess on that. I saw stuff where that right now where you're at in Colorado, generic Republican was beating Michael Bennet in that seat. And if you have Colorado Senate seat as a toss-up, what that means for some of these other races out there, I know Nevada is one of those races that people are looking a lot at. You could end up having 53, 54, 55 votes on the Republican side of things, depending on how crazy things get. At the state level, though, we're looking at even bigger possibilities here. We saw a little bit of a taste with that with the last year's elections in Virginia and New Jersey, in particular, where some major gains within the state legislative process there. My friend Ryan Godersky, who is he has a national populist newsletter, which some disagreements on policy prescriptions, but his breakdown on different races I always find extremely interesting. He actually had a newsletter out today highlighting the possibility for Republicans to take over the state legislatures in Connecticut, New Mexico, Maine, Nevada, Minnesota, and Oregon, as well as flipping massive seats, multiple seats in Colorado, Massachusetts, making gains in areas like Florida and Texas, even chipping into the margins of New York, the New York Assembly. And if that happens, it's important not only in terms of the impact that it has on state policy. Hopefully that will lead to, it's always I think when we look back at sort of the missed opportunities of the 2010 wave, I think that's very much true at the federal level. I think, however, if you measure the performance of state legislatures in Republican states after 2010, there's a lot of good policies that got done, like pretty substantial, and multiple states got rid of the income tax. You had a lot of changes done on professional licensing and things like that. You had some pretty significant cuts to various programs. So I think the state legislative policy is often a lot more interesting. You can get a lot more done there. So that the potential for that as a result of this is important. The other side of it, though, is the Democratic Party never really recovered from that. The talent you miss when you have such a massive knockout of young state reps, because those state reps become congressmen, right? Or they become, they end up with an administration position, as undersecretary of, whatever. And that is, those end up being the future leaders of the party. Now, admittedly, Donald Trump was not a 2010 Tea Party product, but Ted Cruz was, who was kind of his second guy there. Marco Rubio, who campaigned a little bit better back in 2010 than he has been as a senator in Florida. He's part of that wave, right? Rand Paul was part of that wave. The impact this has going forward. I mean, the reason why you have Democrats talking about Hillary Clinton as a potential nominee in 2024 goes directly to that lack of talent and that lack of bench. And so that aspect of it, along with the potential for changing state legislative policy, I think both of those are long-term consequences that could come from what appears to be a very, very red midterm election.
Yeah, if you look at the state-by-state approval, disapproval ratings for Biden, right, you can find that only the bluest of the blue states is Biden doing well in right now. You can look at Colorado, and Biden's underwater, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, maybe 12%. And so that, I think that if that does translate then into motivated Republicans, I'm just hoping, well, of course, it'd be great if you had some sort of, huge turnover. But I'm just hoping for the state Senate to flip, and because at least then there's going to be a veto on the worst policies. Because every time you got both House, Senate, and the governor all controlled by any party, really, that's when the crazies have free reign and all sorts of stuff happens. So if you got at least one veto in there, so that could really benefit a lot of people if they just had maybe one house of the state house flipping back away from the Dems. And that could also ensure and be interpreted also as payback or retribution for lockdowns, right? If it becomes clear that those people who supported lockdowns are defeated in large numbers in 2022, well, that just makes it clear then that your half-life on supporting things like lockdowns is really, really short, and you should probably think long and hard before taking such drastic steps. I think that some politicians had a better idea of how quick that would go away as a highly popular move. I think Jared Polis was one of them. I think he always seemed enthusiastic about just getting away from that as quickly as he could for political reasons. But you had some people who, just kept doubling down on the idea of lockdowns, lecturing everybody, treating everyone like a 2-year-old. And if those people lose, then you better believe people will be just mentioning that many times over into 5 years from now. Anytime the CDC comes back and starts talking about any sort of drastic measure in the future, they'll just be saying, hey, remember what happened to so-and-so when he or she was governor. And I think that would be a good thing. But even if in the leadership in Washington, even if you end up with the usual idiots in charge of the highest levels of part of the parties, I mean, yeah, you could still end up with Rand Paul getting a chairmanship in the Senate and able to use that power to do some good things in terms of discrediting Fauci and engaging in other investigations and fact-finding missions, and just using that position to engage in maybe some nice questioning of the narrative when it's necessary.
There's an interesting drive right now to try to get Republican members of Congress, or at least candidates running for Congress, to commit to investigating Fauci. Which again, that to me is the bare minimum that should be expected, but it's also more than what we're used to getting from malfeasance from these administrative positions. And so that's one of those little things where, if Republicans actually seriously investigate and hopefully pass, get serious about criminal charges, and this is what Rand has talked about publicly about Fauci, that would be a major blow to the administrative state. That again, I'm not expecting a lot of good legislation to come through the modern Republican Party, but that's one of those little things that's right at the intersection of partisan political theater with, that it doesn't require necessary, legislative action and all the difficulties of getting anything done through the Senate, but actually has, it's something symbolic that has a lot of real meaning. I was diving in through completely unrelated Walter Block's old literature on libertarian Nuremberg trials, which I think might have some relevance in dealing with some of the excesses of the worst actors of the COVID regime. To that point, though, as well, I think the thing that I think is also important is not only that Trump lost, but the way Trump lost. I know we've talked about this in the past, and a lot of this is going to be redundant to regular listeners, but the blow in terms of legitimacy of the election process by Trump highlighting, the unique aspects of that 2020 election. When you have conservatives that otherwise, have at least, again, they have their flaws, but sort of have a romantic idea of those old school American virtues, right? Of individualism and self-reliance and capitalism and pure Americana sort of stuff. It's been faith in the institution of government, in the Constitution, right? This sort of civic pride that I think has often been a blinder to a lot of the great horrors of federal policy. And that kind of leads itself to, oh, well, yes, this is very, very bad, but the people that didn't mean to do bad, right? And it's like, it's just, that's just the way governments operate. And there's a little bit of, it becomes a defensive mechanism against some of the worst aspects of the state. I think a lot of that is eroded away. I think the faith in the Constitution itself being some sort of great check. It's not they don't believe in what they think the Constitution means and meant, and what it was, what the proper role of it. But I think they recognize that this is more than simply having political opponents in charge. That there's something more sinister, more fundamentally corrupt here. And I think that is the proper way of viewing the regime, particularly after the 20th century, and hopefully the big flamboyant way that Trump did this, and only the way he can. I think that might be a lasting scar that will be very difficult for them to cover up. And hopefully that will lead to a more radical Republican Party rather than what we've seen in the past, where you have a great big, election that seems like it could be good, like the Tea Party, and yet have it just end up, being controlled and neutered, 1 year in. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of extra teeth here. And that's going to be, I think, one of the ways of measuring just how impactful is this period in terms of long term of our relationship with federal institutions.
Well, it's always been true, of course, about presidential elections or elections in general, where if the question is, did so-and-so win this election? The correct answer is, I don't know. I'm not sure. It's never 100% sure. There's always things that could go wrong. There's always corruption. But as you say, right, there's long been this idea that these institutions were rock solid and that everyone was doing their best to respect the outcomes of elections and that there was no real meaningful fraud in any way and that the right man was selected. Now, of course, you and I are both students of 19th century American politics, so we know that plenty of elections have been iffy throughout time. But I think, especially when you encounter older people and maybe they went to grade school in the 50s when they were just bombarded with all that propaganda about how the United States is a uniquely virtuous nation and everything's run really quite well. And we, as the righteous nation, won in 1945, and now we're the shining city on the hill. And I think that had a big effect on people of that generation. And you're right, that view that everything's fundamentally working was just, we just need to try harder to communicate our position. And you saw perhaps that hilarious tweet, I don't know, maybe it was an old tweet from Michael Malice about how the role of conservatives in recent decades has been to constantly explain that the other side has good intentions, right? This has been the Republican role, right? Oh, yeah, well, because if you look at the deep economics of it and you carry the two and you look at the variation of X, we can all see that, sure, this economic policy was bad. But if there is one thing we cannot doubt, it is that the other side has the best intentions and only wants what's best for America. So you would be wrong, dear voter, to possibly question the motivations of the other side. And I think you're right. The fact that people recognize for maybe the first time that elections, maybe they are corrupt, right? We don't know for a fact that Trump was cheated, but just the fact that many people are admitting that there's corruption in the process and that people are willing to go to great lengths, many of them corrupt lengths, to hold on to power. That possibility now seems plausible to a much larger number of people. Boy, is that a lot of progress. And so, yes, maybe that'll make a big, big difference.
And I think this is why Trump, and I think in many ways, is the anti-Reagan in a very, very important way. And that is Reagan, you had this growing conservative movement, right? The Goldwater years, and it's called the best parts of the Buckley National Review stuff, with the understanding that you had a lot of bad within that, but you had the best aspects of this American conservative movement, right? And it all captures with the election of Ronald Reagan. They finally did it. They've been spending decades trying to do this. They finally accomplish it. Ronald Reagan, one of their own, is elected president. And then what does he do? He makes H.W. Bush, who was criticizing him for voodoo economics and represented everything in the Republican Party and the conservatives had been fighting, for those decades. He brings him on as VP. And then afterwards, and then the Republican Party around him ends up being the party of H.W. Bush, not the party of Ronald Reagan. And so then that created a situation where you had a H.W. Bush style Republican Party using the rhetoric of Reagan, duping conservatives who were much closer aligned with us, and they were able to take advantage of these conservatives. And it's because Reagan told the conservative group that we can trust our enemies. Donald Trump, who I think ideologically is far less conservative to Reagan, right? In terms of the way that he could articulate whatever his political philosophy might be. What he did, though, is he convinced conservatives that the people that hate them really hate them. And it might be out of vanity, he doesn't like these people because they don't like Trump, and therefore Trumpers shouldn't like them because they don't like Trump. Like, I'm fine, whatever. It doesn't matter the intensity of that intellectual argument there. Ultimately, the impact is the same. And that is why Liz Cheney's getting kicked out of the House in Wyoming. This is why nobody wants the endorsement of George W. Bush, right? There's not a single living president in the Republican Party besides George Bush, or besides Donald Trump, whose opinion has meant anything in a primary for the last, ever since 2016. And I think that aspect, again, long-reaching, if that continues, is something that could create some interesting dynamics down the line, and hopefully, we'll open the door for more, Ron Paul-styled, Republicans to have an impact on policy, and perhaps taking advantage of this inflationary populist moment that we're living in.
All right. Well, we'll have to let that be the last word on this topic. Thank you for joining us again on Radio Rothbard, and we'll be back again with a new episode soon, and we'll see you then.